All right, guys. So if you were here, you chose Joseph Plumb Martin, and I'm going to read to you from "We Were There Too: Young People in U.S. History" by Philip Hoos. It's an informational book that I have, and here is Joseph Plumb Martin. And now I was a soldier. Joseph Plumb Martin was a tall, strong, hard-working boy who grew up in his grandparents' farm in Connecticut. Though he never went to school, he managed to write one of the best diaries of the Revolutionary War. So we're going to hear some excerpts and things from his diary. Joseph Martin forced the metal plow down deep into the stony soil where his grandfather walked alongside, guiding the horse that pulled it. It was a fresh April morning, a perfect planting day. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of bells and gunshots in Milford. Joseph dropped the plow and dashed into town, his grandfather following behind as fast as he could. A crowd was gathered in front of the tavern, where an express rider from New Haven shouted news of 3 days before. There had been a bloody battle in Concord, Massachusetts. Many were dead. Soldiers were needed right now, and $1 was the reward for anyone who would enlist or join the army in the American Army and march off to New York to join General Washington. But Joseph was only 14, a year too young to enlist. And until that day, his thoughts about soldiering had been very clear. I felt myself to be a real coward. What? Venture and my carcass and have bullets fly at it? That will never do for me. Stay at home, out of harm's way, is what I thought. But now his friends his age, and even younger, were scribbling their names and grabbing up these dollars while adults cheered them on. Joseph was torn. He hated to stay home while his friends marched off into glory, and the thought of a whole $1 made the seeds of courage begin to sprout in his mind. But he needed more time to get used to this idea. 2 months later, he was ready. On June 25th, 1776, Joseph slipped away from his grandparents' house and hiked into town, his mind made up to enlist for 6 months, the shortest term possible. When a group of boys he saw him coming toward the tavern, they began to taunt him. "Come, if you'll enlist, I will," says one. "You have been talking about it for so long," says another. "Come, now is the time." Thinks I to myself, I will not be laughed into it, or even out of it. I will act my own pleasure after all. So seating myself at a table, enlisting orders were immediately presented to me. I took up the pen, loaded it with the fatal charge of ink, made several mimicking imitations of writing my name, but took especial care not to touch the paper with the pen until an unlucky friend, who was leaning over my shoulder, gave my hand a strike, which caused the pen to make a woeful scratch on the paper. "Oh, he has enlisted," he said. Well, I thought, I may as well go through with this business now as not. So I wrote my name fairly upon the indentures, and now I was a soldier, in name at least. His grandparents were very unhappy, but they fit him out with clothing and a musket and powder. His grandmother gave him cheese and cake and stuffed his Bible into his knapsack. He sailed to New York City to join the Connecticut Company. For more than a month, all they did was march in parades and practice battle drills. Joseph's biggest problem was getting used to the food: salt pork or boiled beef, hard bread, and turnips or boiled potatoes. But even as they practiced, hundreds of British warships were arriving at nearby Staten Island, unloading 32,000 red-coated soldiers. Late in August, Joseph's company was ordered to Long Island to stop British forces from taking New York City. Just before they marched off, Joseph climbed onto the roof of a house and squinted in the direction of the battlefield. I distinctly saw the smoke of the field artillery, but the distance and the unfavorableness of the wind prevented my hearing their report, at least faintly. The horrors of battle then presented themselves to my mind in all their hideousness. The horrors of battle. I must come to it now, I thought. They took a ferry across the East River to Brooklyn and marched toward a field. The shots growing louder and louder with each step until they boomed like thunder. We now began to meet the wounded men, another sight I was unacquainted with or not used to. With some of the broken arms, some of broken legs, and some with broken heads. The sights of these scared me and made me think of home. And then, all at once, he was fighting too. Our officers pressed forward towards a creek where a large party of Americans and British were engaged in battle. By the time we arrived, the enemy had driven our men into the creek, where such as could swim to get across. Those that could not swim and could not procure anything to buoy themselves up, they sunk. On the opposite bank of the creek, he could make out a long row of British soldiers, professional-looking warriors from Britain, and from what was their best army in the world. They stood straight and tall in red jackets as they fired on command at the retreating Americans. The creek was filling up with the American bodies. Joseph's company shot back furiously, trying to provide some cover for these still thrashing through the water. Then they marched onto part of Manhattan called Kip's Bay and readied themselves for yet another battle. One night, they camped so close to a British warship that Joseph could overhear soldiers on board mocking the Americans. Early on a Sunday morning, Joseph slipped into an unlocked warehouse for a rare moment of privacy and peace. He was seated on a stool, reading some papers he'd discovered. And all of a sudden, there came such a peal of thunder from the British shipping that he thought that his head would go with the sound. He made a frog leap for the ditch as he lay as still as possible and began to consider which part of his body would go first. They were soon dashing for their lives, leaping over bodies of their friends. As Joseph put it, the demons of fear and disorder seemed to take full possession of all and everything that day. Joseph was still alive when October came and cool weather set in, and life got even more uncomfortable. To have to lie, as I did almost every night on the cold and often wet ground, without a blanket and with nothing but thin summer clothing, was awful. In the morning, the ground often was as white as snow with frost, or perhaps it would rain all night like a flood. All that could be done in case was to lie down, take our musket in our arms, and lock between our thighs and hope that the weather would stop. When Joseph was discharged from the Continental Army on Christmas Day, 1776, discharged means he was allowed to leave, he felt older than 15. A battle-tested patriot who was proud that he had stood his ground against the British. He set off for home, 52 miles away, with 4 shillings of discharge pay in his pocket and enough stories to get him through the winter and more. He farmed for a year, got bored, and re-enlisted in the army. When the war ended 6 years later, he was still a soldier. And he was also a free citizen in a new nation. So that's the end of our story. But then it does go on to say what happened to Joseph Plumb Martin. So here's what happened to him after we finally had freedom, and he was able to be that free citizen in our country. So here's what happened to him. He moved to Maine in 1794 and began to farm. He married and became the father of 5 children. He loved to write, tell stories, and draw pictures of birds. When he was 70, the Revolutionary War account was published. He died in Maine at the age of 90. So you can see on your slide deck that he did write a book, and that was what some of this was coming from. Some was pulled excerpts and quotes from that book. I hope you enjoyed our story of Joseph Plumb Martin, and I hope you learned something. If you learned something, go ahead and put it in your graphic organizer. All right.